It's great to see everyone here, and it's just good to be here this morning. Let's just start off by reading from Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3. It says, "By the seventh day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made." We noticed in the bulletin article last week or the week before, it's sort of unusual. It repeats that God worked, the work that God had done, the work that God had done. He rested from his work. And not only does it emphasize his work, but also his rest. He rested on the seventh day. It says twice in these verses, he rested. Did you ever wonder why it is that God needed to rest? Or if he did not need to rest, why did God rest? I've wondered that before. You know, if God has infinite power and he can do anything and he just spoke the universe into existence, why is it described as work and as resting? Perhaps it means that there is something divine about a cycle of creating and then resting, of working and then ceasing to work, because even God himself is working and then resting. So maybe we shouldn't see work as a curse, but as something that is beautiful. But maybe we should also see rest, not as this necessary evil that you have to do so you can go back to the important work, but as something else that is divine, that God himself does and that he has laid out for us to do. And indeed, it's true, not only did God rest, but he meant for it to be a pattern for us to follow. It says in this passage, God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it. That is, he set aside a time in which he wanted people to make a point of resting. God has built rest into life. And he repeated this to the people over and over again. So in Exodus 20, verses 8 through 11, we read, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servant or your cattle, or your sojourners who stay with you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." So it emphasizes that when God rested, he was setting a pattern for us to work and to rest. And a study of the Bible will reveal that we are not obligated by the old law that the Jews were given to rest and do no work on a certain day of the week. So the message for us isn't just that you must observe the Sabbath, which was on a Saturday, and that you can't do anything. And some Jews had taken that to the extreme. You know, you couldn't open your door on the Sabbath. You couldn't do anything. But it does show us quite clearly that God wanted to remind us to rest. He said again 3 chapters later in Exodus 23, verse 12, "6 days you are to do your work, but on the seventh day you shall cease from labor, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female slave as well as your stranger may refresh themselves." He intends for this rest to extend to everyone. They might not be inclined to think about servants or about strangers, and God's making it clear everyone needs to rest, and he even mentions the animals need to rest. Rest is so built into the world around us, God intends for it to be a part of life for everyone. Again, in Exodus 34, verse 21, he said, "You shall work 6 days, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during plowing time and harvest, you shall rest." You get the idea that it was important because he told them over and over again, rest. And he told them everyone needs to have a rest. And he told them even in harvest, you need to rest. And not only was there a day of rest every 7 days, there was a year of rest every 7 years as well. In Exodus 23, 10 and 11, he said, "For you shall sow your land for 6 years and gather in its yield. But on the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, so that the needy of your people may eat. and whatever they leave, the beasts of the field may eat. You are to do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove." So he also had this year of restfulness every 7 years to allow the ground to rest as well. In Leviticus 25, 2-5, he said, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its crop. But during the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field nor prune your vineyard. Your harvest after growth you shall not reap, and your grapes of untrimmed vines you shall not gather, and the land shall have a sabbatical year." But we can take things a step further. Not only was there a day of rest every 7 days, a year of rest every 7 years, there was a special rest for every 7 set of 7 years. Leviticus 25, 8-12 says, "You are also to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. And he says, "You shall thus consecrate the 50th year and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, and each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall have the 50th year as a jubilee. You shall not sow nor reap its aftergrowth, nor gather it from its untrimmed vines. For it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You shall eat its crops out of the field." You'll notice that in a lot of these verses there is language of holiness, or of being sanctified, or of observing the Sabbath for the Lord. It becomes clear that taking time to rest can be a sacred thing. It's something that God commands us to do, and he had a lot of instructions for Israel to remind them to take that rest. So there it is again in Genesis 2, 2 and 3, reminding us that God rested. And there are all kinds of ways in the world in which the need for rest is built into the world the way he created it. You have the agricultural example of allowing the ground to rest, which he asked them to do. I mean, if you think about it, consider talking. You can only talk so much before you have to stop and take a breath. And there's only so much work that you can do while neglecting eating and drinking before you must stop and take some time and eat and drink. There's only so much time that you can spend awake before you have to stop and sleep. In fact, most of us spend about a third of our lives sleeping. We can't just go and never have a break. The way God has designed music, when we make music, it is appealing to us when there are rests in the sound. Our muscles cannot keep going without having a break sometimes. Or maybe you think about thinking or reading books. In Song of Solomon, we're told, or not in Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, we're told by Solomon that in much reading and making of books there is weariness. So he advised us even in reading and thinking to give ourselves a break sometime. I think this may be one reason why men in particular often love to hunt and to fish. It gives you an opportunity to get away, to get a different perspective, to take a break. In 1 Kings 19, 11-13, I think we have sort of a mysterious passage, but maybe it gives us a little window into a part of who God is and why he would make 6 days for work and 1 day for rest, or have a lot of power in the creation, but also have a time of quiet and peace. This is happening to Elijah. It says, "Behold, the Lord was passing by, and a great and strong wind was rending the mountains and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire a sound of gentle blowing. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave." So all of these powerful signs were preceding God, and yet it was when there was just this gentle breeze that Elijah knew that God was there, that his glory was finally passing by, and Elijah knew to go out and to meet God. Perhaps there is a part of God that is constantly working and doing and creating and powerful, but perhaps there is a part of him also that is restful and is peaceful and calm. And he wants us to understand that part of him as well. Maybe this is why he spoke in 1 Peter 3 and 4 to women, and he said, "Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair and wearing gold jewelry or putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of the Lord," or in the sight of God. God said that he finds it precious when someone has a gentle and quiet spirit. It's this imperishable quality, almost this part of eternity that he's put into our hearts, this part of him that is divine, this quiet restfulness. And so from here, I'd like to talk to us for the remainder of our time about having quiet time with God, or having periods of rest that are wholly for him, that are dedicated to him, that follow his pattern of working and then resting. And think about how we can benefit from having those quiet, peaceful times. One obvious advantage is that quiet time with God helps us to focus on God. And Jesus gave us a good example of this in what he did. Luke 5:16 says, Jesus himself would often slip away to the wilderness and pray. And we know that Jesus was a very, very busy person. He always had people coming to him, wanting them to heal him. He had towns that he needed to go around and visit so that he could preach the gospel to them. He always had something to do. And yet it says he would often slip away to the wilderness and pray. And Luke 6 gives us one particular example of that. It says, in those days, Jesus went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. There was a good portion of time that he spent. I don't know if you've ever spent the night in prayer. Most of us, myself included, tend to pray for shorter amounts of time than that. But he had this block of time that he devoted to that, and he went away to be by himself. And he taught his apostles to do that as well. In Luke 9:28, it says, he took Peter, John, and James and went up on a mountain to pray. And imagine that he went up on a mountain, or went into the wilderness, because that was away from all of the things in life that could take his focus off of God. He could get away from all of the people and from all of the things and have that opportunity to focus on God. James 4:8 says, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. And setting aside a time to be calm and quiet and to focus on him is a good way to begin drawing near to him, so that he will draw near to us. Along similar lines is the idea that quiet time with God helps us to eliminate distractions. And we have plenty of distractions in our life that can keep us from drawing near to him. I like the story of Zacchaeus because it sort of provides a real-world physical example of the concept of sanctification. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So it says, Zacchaeus was trying to see who Jesus was and was unable because of the crowd, for he was small in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree in order to see him, for he was about to pass through that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. So the word sanctification, you've probably heard before, means set apart. And in the most literal sense, it actually means to cut something. So you might have like a lump of dough, and you would cut it and set some of it away from the rest. And Zacchaeus literally sort of set himself apart from the crowd. And he did that because he couldn't see through all of them to Jesus. I mean, he was too short, and there were too many tall people in front of him. And maybe in life, there are a lot of tall things in front of us that culture has put up that make it difficult to see through all of it to God. And maybe we need to make a point of going up on a mountain or in the wilderness or in the sycamore tree, or maybe it's in your room somewhere away, somewhere that sets us apart and sets that time apart and sanctifies it so that we can get a clearer view. Zacchaeus was able to see Jesus because he got himself away from all of the things that were distracting him, that were between him and God. Quiet time with God requires that we trust in God. I believe it teaches us to trust in Him if we are willing to be quiet with Him. You know, one verse from Psalm 46 that we often repeat and think about says, "Cease striving and know that I am God," or "Be still and know that I am God." And I want to share some of the context in Psalm 46 of this verse that we often repeat. It starts in the first 3 verses by saying, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, and though the mountains should slip into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride." The backdrop of this verse, "Cease striving and know that I am God," isn't itself a backdrop of peace and calm and quiet. They're saying, though all kinds of crazy things should be going on around us, God is our refuge and strength. We will trust in Him. He will be present with us in the midst of our trouble. It goes on, if we look at verses 8 through 11, to say, "Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has wrought desolations in the earth. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots with fire. Cease striving and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold." So Israel had plenty of things to worry about as a nation. They were this small little nation in the Middle East, and there were some other big, powerful nations like Egypt around them who they needed to fear and who they had good reason to fear. And it's sort of in that context, in a military context, that God says, "Cease striving and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." As if to say, trust in me, that as my chosen people, you will be taken care of. That I will be exalted among the nations, and I will be exalted in the earth, because I am God, and I do have things under control. So it's not really a peaceful backdrop, and yet in that situation, God says, "Cease striving and know that I'm God." And I don't think He meant, don't go to battle. If they come to attack you, don't do anything, just stay in bed or whatever. But He means to trust in God, to have a certain quiet in their soul in that situation. And there's an example of that put into practice in Exodus 14, 13 and 14. It says, "But Moses said to the people, 'Do not fear. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians, whom you have seen today, you will never see them again forever. The Lord will fight for you while you keep silent.'" And so it doesn't seem that He's saying, don't bother to go out to battle at all. You don't have to do anything. But He is telling them that God's going to be with them, and that because of that, there can be a peace and a quiet. They can keep silent. They can trust in Him. Quiet time with God teaches us to rely on God. So if we put this into practice in our life, we don't have military conquests to achieve. 1 Peter 5, 6 and 7 says, "Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you at the proper time, casting all your anxiety on Him, because He cares for you." In time that we set aside for God to rest and to be still and quiet and calm, we will need to give our anxieties to Him in order to find that calm. And that will require us to acknowledge that He is in control and to trust Him to take care of us. Romans 8 tells us one way in which that happens. It says, "In the same way, the Spirit also helps our weaknesses. For we do not know how to pray as we should, but the Spirit Himself intercedes with us with groanings too deep for words. And He who searches the hearts knows what the mind of the Spirit is, because He intercedes for the saints according to the will of God." You know, being alone with God is a special situation because people may not understand what we are going through. People just may not be able to understand. We each have our own life experiences, and we may not even understand ourselves. Romans 8 says we don't know how to pray as we should. We don't even know what to ask for, what to say to God. And yet His Spirit, in a way that is beyond even words, beyond even what we might be able to understand, can know our hearts and can be with us in those quiet times to intercede for us, to give us peace that God knows what we need, to help us to entrust ourselves to Him so that He will help us in those times. And one more thing is that quiet time with God allows us to listen to God. It's one of those common sense principles that if we are constantly talking or going and doing, that we may not be able to listen to what He is saying and doing. In Ecclesiastes 5:2, the preacher says, "Do not be hasty in word or impulsive in thought to bring up a matter in the presence of God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few." And from what we know of the Bible, it doesn't seem that the preacher would be telling us, well, you shouldn't pray very often. You know, the Bible tells us to pray without ceasing. But he says, don't be hasty or impulsive in thought to bring up a matter in the presence of God. As if he's saying, don't make your prayer to God all about what you have to say and not about hearing what He has to say. That you're so anxious to pour everything out to Him, to be the one doing all the speaking. Don't be hasty or impulsive in that way. Instead, we can have the attitude that Samuel had in 1 Samuel chapter 3 and verse 10. Then the Lord came and stood and called, as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant is listening." He was ready to hear what God had to say. And we are not talking about a miraculous voice, that speaks to us in a special way that other people don't get to experience. We're talking about the Word of God, inspired by the Holy Spirit, that we can open up and that we can read to know what His will is and to see, as we're guided by His Spirit, all of the ways that it applies to our lives as individuals. Quiet time with God helps us to focus on God and eliminate distractions. It requires trust and teaches reliance, because in order to be quiet, to cease bringing everything to Him long enough to hear Him, means that we'll have to put our trust in Him to take care of us, and it then allows us to listen to Him. I believe that is a part of that divine picture of working and resting. One of the reasons why He reminds us to rest, so that we have opportunities to get a different perspective, to be refreshed, to focus on Him and not only on ourselves or on all of the things around us, whether they be worthless things or whether they be necessary parts of life that can distract us from Him. And lastly, let's look at Matthew 11:28 through 30, where Jesus says, "Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." It is amazing how dynamic God's personality is, that He is incredibly powerful in a way that would terrify us if we saw even a glimpse of it. And at the same time, in addition to all the power that can create the universe by speaking, There's that rest on the seventh day that he invites us into, and which Jesus manifests for us here. When he says, I'm gentle and humble in heart, you'll find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. He offers us to rest in his power, to submit ourselves to his authority, to do work for him day in and day out, but to have times of refreshing as well. I've heard it said before, you can't live your life on the mountaintop, but you can be recharged there. Not every moment of our lives is this great, peaceful, refreshing moment, and it doesn't have to be. The ratio in creation was 6 days of work and 1 day of rest, but those moments give us an opportunity to recharge. But Jesus himself gives us an invitation here, which I would just like to draw our attention to in Matthew 11. He says, come to me if you're weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And that's the invitation that is extended to us this morning. It's an invitation to learn more about him, to listen to his words, to open up the Bible, to have quiet time to open it and hear what he is saying to us. It's an invitation to repent of our sins and to be baptized for the remission of those sins and to be transformed by him day in and day out. And that's the extension, the invitation I extend to you this morning from the Bible, to come and find rest with him. And if we can help you in any way, you can come as we stand and sing this morning.